Greeting. When Christian Berg Hervinken asked me to reply to the question, why is religion at the core of global contentions in the 21st century? I looked around me in Beirut, where some of my acquaintances see religions as everything in their everyday life, while others see it as nothing. The short answer to this question would be because in many places in our globe, we live in the time of an impossible reasonable debate. Demagogical times animated by the vertiginous rise of populism and authoritarianism. A much better and clearer short answer would be that there is so much misunderstanding between the religious and the secular in our scholarship and media. Misunderstanding of religion in its relationships to politics, economy, culture, or simply to society. Religiosity is increasing in most of the regions, and secularism has become, in many places, a sort of civic religion against other religions. Historically, the social sciences and the humanities put too much emphasis on the negative aspects of religion. An important research program titled International Panel on Social Progress suggests that religion and religiosity play a major role in social progress and resistance to colonialism and tyranny, but can also generate forces of violence, conservatism, sectarianism, and social and political subjugation. The same religion can play different roles in different contexts. In Brazil, the follower of the Pentecostal church who had voted for left-wing leader Lula also voted in 2019 for right-wing leader Bolsonaro. Religion is often understood as a separate social sphere. I belong to anti-authoritarian sociology that refuses to see society as differentiated into separate compartments, one of them being religion. The spheres of religion, culture, politics, social, and economy are traversed by common logics that allow a given society to be encompassed in its totality, exactly as Marcel Mauss and Karl Polanyi did. Due to this differentiation approach, there is so much misunderstanding between the secular versus the religious, and the religious and the other spheres. In my talk, I will proceed with 3 highlights only. Otherwise, my talk will last for an entire day. First, I will deconstruct rigid secularism as one of the sources of this misunderstanding. Then I will look more closely to the relationship between religion and economy. Finally, I will provide you with an example from the Arab world, but this time scrutinizing the relationship between the religious and the political. Let us begin with rigid secularism. In many regions, there is a real problem of conflicting elite formations in which social sciences scholarship is not always sensitive to norms and values from the performative perspective of social actors. This is not because religious can take the form of illiberal doctrine, but also those who are anti-clericalist become illiberal as well. These days, I would argue that some models of secularism are illiberal. This kind of secularism become a model where we invite non-Western countries to adopt the dominant Western models particularly the French one. This positivist and sometimes ideological paradigm considers religion on the opposite end of the spectrums with rationality, and that's merely a minor sub-phenomenon or superstructure which will be overcome with the development of industrial economy structures and its associated scientific culture, to become something of the past. It perceived secularism as a process of privatizing religion and isolated it in the private sphere. In the same vein, the Canadian sociologist François Gauthier recently published an extraordinary book on religion, modernity, and globalization, in which he raised a similar question to my talk. How would we understand today the nature and the social location of religion? Gauthier's book took us to a formidable tour arguing that the social sciences blinded it themselves with the secularization paradigm that contain three distinct propositions: social differentiation, religious decline, and privatization. For him, and I agree with him, the three propositions are currently problematic. Instead, he proposes that to understand the mutation of religion against the rise of consumerism and neoliberalism. In the last few years, Gauthier, along with Robert Seberiani, Armando Salvatori, and Mohamed Bamieh, among others, of course, pointed out the resilience of religious worldwide and critiqued some trends within the sociology of religion that sought killing religion, at least as a value, while studying it. Gauthier criticized substantive definitions of religion and how this field of sociology has been obsessed with the sole perspective of decline, while the other research, particularly in the global south, show how the situation is profoundly different in the part of the world and diffracted into a multiplicity of practices. As I said before, religion is often understood as a separate social sphere. Morality and social cohesion can get their source from religion, but not only. They can get as well from diverse forms of everyday cooperation between human beings, i.e., locating them at the bottom of the sociality. Religion, how it is perceived by most religious people, is important because of its potentiality to cultivate gift-giving practices as an anthropological foundation innate within social relationships. The form of exchange is a complex of altruistic and self-interested behavior that was obligated and obligating as much as it was free and voluntary. This is very different from how, for a long time, many scholars conceived human beings as homo economicus, seeking simply to maximize their interests. The non-acknowledgement of the embeddedness of economy in other social spheres is in tandem with the erection of a thick wall of separation between the religious and the secular. This separation and compartmentalization have often served to alienate more those who believes in the role of religion in their life and ended up pushing them to vote for those who care about preserving their values. This is, alas, how many populist governments have been elected by procedural democracy. These governments tend to champion conservative religious values and transform them into ethno-religious ideologies that goes against our age of pluralism. Again, I'm not here to idealize religion, but to be closer to the meanings that social actors and social movements would give. Yet, ideology and religious interpretations are important, diverse drivers, but should be understood in their political and social context, and perhaps cannot be seen as separate explanations. The Dutch sociologist Peter Nanninga, who primarily writes up against the generic use of Islam as an explanation for why suicide attacks accelerated in the Muslim world since the 1980s, urge us to consider the historical, political, social, and cultural context that impact both individuals and movements. Thus, how religion has been employed in the discourse of religious movements tend to parallel the prevailing characters of the larger social environments in which they operate. In the Arab world, and as the Palestinian-American sociologist Mohammed Bamie rightly argued, the Muslim Brotherhood was liberal in its outlook during the times of its founder in the 40s because they lived in the liberal time, and militarized when they lived under military rules. I mean, Nasser times in the 50s. And when the regime became so totalitarian and violent, like that of Syria and Iraq, we had terrorist organizations emerged, such as ISIS, for which violence is one of its pillars, if not the primary pillar. Its ideology should be considered as counter-modern rather than traditional. But then one would wonder if we think not about the Arab world, but about Europe. Why would some French youth from North African origin who live in a democratic state join ISIS? I would like to quote here the outstanding French-Iranian sociologist, my friend Farhad Khosrow-Khafar, saying, I quote, "The attraction of the self-proclaimed caliphate was based on the disillusionment of modernity, particularly for the disaffected youth and middle classes, both squeezed by the lack of opportunity and the absence of hope in their social life." End of quote. ISIS dystopia is a symptom of the crisis of modern values for people living in societies that are more and more unfair and unjust toward them. This becomes more complex for these French young people who are sons of immigrants when one added the colonial wound. That remains one of the most significant of ongoing effects of coloniality, to talk like Caroline Irena. Being critical of how we establish a sharp dichotomy between the religious and the secular, I will not do sweeping generalization in my criticism of secularization and secularism in order not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Secularism as operating mechanism are salient when it meets two conditions. First, when the separation between religious institutions and state institutions are securing liberal democratic ideals, and then when the state's neutrality is restricted to reply to the notion of the overlapping consensus about the good. We should keep looking at what the Indian political theorist Rajesh Bhargava called principal distance between state and religion. A proper distance based on the principle of equity and favorizing the values of peace, universal rights, dignity, freedom, equality, and fraternity. I am calling to better work out the post-secularity, which is generally associated with the plurality of views and practices resulting not from the negation of secularity, but rather from the rise of comprehensive reflexivity of secularity and secularization. As a French philosopher, Cécile Laborde rightly suggests, we should start from liberal democratic ideals and then ask how much and what kind of state separation from religions is required to secure these ideals. The implications of this are huge. In a region like in the Arab world, in the context of the Arab Spring, where some secularist elite has allied with the military to throw the democratically elected government like in Egypt and elsewhere. Alas, this counter-revolutions wave is even supported by some Western countries. In brief, I call for a tailored secularist system that can be more tolerant to the non-authoritarian presence of religion as argumentation and manifestation in the public spheres, and to forge more contextual models that advance our quest for social justice, democracy, and active citizenship. Talking about social justice, let us move on to discuss religion with economy and precisely with marketization. Going back again to Francois Gautier, the recent changes that have affected religion can best be understood against marketization, i.e., the backdrop of the combined emergence of of consumerism and neoliberalism. And this cannot be understood if we don't combine our nation's statist regime approach with the global market regime approach. For instance, we have witnessed the lifestyleization of religion, where many choose to practice a form of religiosity through a new low-threshold practices like mediation, mysticism, festivals, pilgrimage, healing techniques over attending physical places of religion. The amazing rise of global Pentecostalism is an example that fits perfectly into the global market mold. For Gautier, the impact of marketization on religion is having opposing interpretations. One interpretation where secular scholars denounce the religious instrumentalization of the market and produce relatively widespread research concerning the exponential development of halal and Sharia-friendly products worldwide. This is often seen as a manipulation, one that is caused by the combination of globalized market and fundamentalist currents which seek to disseminate fanatic and ideological projects. Gautier rightly points out critically two works in this regard. A study by Gilles Kepel, the French politologist, highlighting the domination of the Salafis a very conservative group over halal in France, and another Iranian scholar in America, Faghe Shirazi's book, Brand Islam. Shirazi similarly denounces the instrumentalization and exploitation of Islam by morally devoid profit-seeking market actors who promotes false halal and produce the hijabi dolls as if the purity of the market and the secular in general is co-opted and soiled by religion. The second perspective worries about the reverse trend, meaning the dangers of commodification for religion. It warns of the impact of consumer culture in having in Christianity and other religious traditions. Here, the purity of religion is threatened by the sallying potential of evil market forces. Instead of this, two above perspectives, and instead of opposing the economic logic against the religious one, Gautier proposes an alternative holistic approach. An economized religion or a religious economy is not the combination of religion and economy, but a series of emergent and intended consequences and ways in which different fields and forces reconfigure each other. As such, we can read religious manifestations as mixed phenomena, i.e., blending politics and religion, management and religion, entertainment and religion, fashion and religion, finance and religion, and so forth, rather than understanding them as assimilations to one pole by the other, or reversely, one should see, as Gautier reminds us, that there is novelty and symbolic efficacy resides specifically in the interbreeding, which in turn can better be understood from a holistic rather than a differentiated perspectives. Looking to the new wave of studying Islamic economy, Islam, especially in South Asia, has contributed to shaping capitalism as much as capitalism has shaped the former national statist Islams. Another example of this entanglement would be how neoliberalism impacts the public-private division by seriously eroding the social and welfare mission of the nation-state. Disengagement from the national economy and the social services has opened up as many areas to the non-profit and entrepreneurial sectors. This was opened new possibilities for religious institutions, movements, and organizations known as the faith-based initiatives in the providing of such services. This can particularly explain by long persistence of religious organizations in the Arab world. The third point after religion and marketization that I will be talking about is religious activism in the Arab world and whether it is a conspiracy, my last point. The political conflicts in the Arab world are triggers, we know, by the persistence of sharply pluralized societies. Not only a huge gap between social classes, but also different elite formations with cultural and identity politics features that make them not even talking with each other. We are in the period of revolutions where political and civil rights supersede, but not replace, the ideological. Many countries showed the importance of some Islamic movements, particularly with their alliance with other oppositional groups. Undergoing internal transformation, some Islamic movements raise slogans that go beyond the simplistic Islam, the simplistic slogan, if you like, Islam is the solution, al-Islam huwa al-hal, towards freedom, democracy, and concrete claims. Several members of the Muslim Brotherhood declared they were neither favor a Western secular state nor a religious one. Instead, they used the notion of civil state, الدولة المدنية, which is a self-referencing exercise that is ambiguous. Despite this blurring of terminology and declarations of some Islamic leaders, there is no reason for many scholars to consider their newly stated position as a smokescreen for a long-term objective of establishing an Islamic state governed by the strict application of Islamic law. These neo-Islamic movements, or what my friend Asif Bayat terms post-Islamist, such as the Renaissance movement, Al-Nahda in Tunisia, or the Justice and Development Party in Morocco, BGD, these movements go beyond certain features of Islamist movements and called for replacing Sharia with the nation as a basis of legitimacy. The difference with the classical Islamism lies in how social actors who believe in Islam as a moral system enter the political arena through separation as opposed to contestation. It also lies in how post-Islamists conduct discussion and debate in the public spheres using arguments inspired by Islamic values. What we witness currently in the Arab world is a shift from an emphasis on Islamic Ummah to an emphasis on nation-state affairs. The support, or at least passive attitude of the Islamist party, PGD, governing party in Morocco, to the normalization with Israel, justifying the primacy of the Moroccan affairs over the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, clearly shows how important the nation-state political imaginary in Islamist ideologies. In his groundbreaking book in 2019, Muhammad Bami highlights how the left often misrepresents the meaning of Islamic activism. For him, Islamic movement give its member the choice between different options using participatory ethics. The basic effect is to create spaces of opportunities for everyday social participation in local, national, and global life, and in ways that are personally felt, compared with secular elite who are often interested in episodical democratic participation. The Islamic ones carried out the everyday participation, assuming many practical forms depending on local need and ability. This range from building neighborhood schools to providing help with housing and marriages, to foster charitable endowment, to participating in political contestation, and so forth. Yet there is no exception. Islam, as a discourse of these social movements, has fit these movements with ordinary social conservatism and political mobilized religiosity, which is similar to that we saw in other parts of the world, such as Christian social democracy in Europe. The analysis of Islamic social movements is very important in order not to recourse to conspiracy of activism. That we often hear that local people are duped into supporting an unrooted movement that has helped them for ulterior motives. Bami is very lucid. There is simply no evidence to support the conspiracious paternalistic theory of Islamic activism in general. In light of the above, while many social scientists as well as journalists keep using the term political Islam, this term is losing really its meaning, as it doesn't recognize the foundational differences between classical Islamism and new Islamism. It is a stereotyping generalization that doesn't account for the heterogeneity of Islamic political thought, from the moderate to the extremist, carried out by individuals and Islamic movements to official Islam. The term political Islam is often used to deride a movement and to suggest that all of their trajectories are the same, composed of Sayyid Qutb of the Muslim Brotherhood to Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Alas, even the French President Emmanuel Macron has a few times announced that he would ban political Islam in France, and currently he, along with his Minister of Interior, is banning many Islamic organizations that are critical of a French tough secularism. It's time to wrap things out. Going back to our question about the religion at the core of a global contentions in the 21st century, we need to rethink how all social spheres work together as a totality in our modernity. This is why, as a president of the International Sociological Association, I decided the theme of its 2022 Congress as a resurgent authoritarianism, the sociology of new entanglements of religions, politics, and economics. Thinking religion dialogically means proceeding from neither religion nor the secular as a given. Religion should be treated as a spiritual salient in the life of some people, but as a banal when it comes or when it becomes ideology. An ideology whose constitutive elements can be fully or partially opposed or welcomed. The serious challenge today is to combine the rule of law with the rule of virtue, and the latter needs constantly ongoing argumentation. As one of the producers of virtue, religion is always involved and seeks moral enforcement through rituals. Moral secularism and religious virtues, while they ascribe to different theist or atheist worldviews or ideologies, are and enter into competitions or even a conflict within each other, should deploy a non-authoritarian practical reasoning. Against the current debate in France about ridiculing the religion of a minority, Islam, and freedom of expression, I invite you to pay more attention to the borderlines between critique and incitement to all forms of hatred. Thank you.